Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for being a part of tonight's webinar. It is the fourth in our Microdynamics series with Stewart Lundy, and we will be looking towards managing pests and disease with biodynamics. I'm Raphael Guzman. I'm a staff member here with the Biodynamic Association. And before we get started, I'm going to go over a few things on Zoom, which is the platform we're using, although I feel that more and more we're all becoming masters of this platform. Just a few things to check in with you to make sure that we have a smooth evening together. So the first thing is, for sound quality of the recording, we ask that you all remain muted unless you're sharing a question. And there are two options to share a question. One is to raise your hand, and that feature can be found by hovering over the bottom bar of your screen. Sometimes if you're on a phone or another iPad or tablet device, it's at the top of your screen. But the black bar, you'll be able to find a silhouette that says participants, and if you click on that, to the right hand of your screen, there'll be a pop-up with everyone who's on the call and an option at the bottom to raise or lower your hand. If you're joining us from a phone, that option to raise your hand is *9, and to lower your hand, it's *9 again. And to mute and unmute yourself on the phone, it's *6, and then *6 again to mute yourself, and you've shared. A tricky thing about the phone, though, is that sometimes you can be doubly muted if you have a mute button on your phone. So look out for that if you're joining us by phone. And another option to share is our chat feature, which I see many of us have already shared where we're coming from and connected. And I'm glad that you've found that. It's at the bottom of the screen again. It's a little speech bubble with 3 little dots that says chat. And you can send a direct message either to myself or Stewart or someone else on the call, or you're able to share with the whole group. And that's a great option to put questions in there as we go, and Stewart has been tremendous with keeping up with them. So that's an excellent option for you as well. If you are sharing and you have raised your hand, I'll go ahead and unmute you and call on you to share, and that can alleviate any muting and unmuting that might happen between us. So if you're having at any time any trouble with connectivity or the audio's jumpy, we do suggest that you turn off your video, and that can redirect some of your bandwidth to the Zoom call on a whole. And if that does not support any connectivity issues, the best next step is to actually step out of the session, close it all down, and then re-enter. And if you do that, please know it doesn't disturb the rest of us in the session. And of course, there will be a recording that will be available to you tomorrow, so you won't miss anything there. All right. Now, does anyone have any questions about Zoom before we begin? Feel free to unmute yourself if you do, or practice raising your hand. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. Let's check the chat. All right, so no questions for Zoom. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand the floor over to Stewart. Let's get started.
All right. As most of you probably know at this point, my name is Stewart Lundy. I'm with Perennial Roots Farm in Accomack, Virginia. We're on the Eastern Shore, kind of this appendix that sticks out between the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. So we deal with a lot of humidity, We're very close to the ocean, and that's kind of what I have to think about when I'm dealing with plant diseases. We'll have more of fungal problems than some people. We have more of a mildew tendency just because of the high humidity in the air, and you'll all be dealing with different climatic conditions. But what we're going to deal with can seem in some ways almost to be, for lack of a better word, it can almost seem violent. When we're trying to deal with a pest or a disease, if we're combating it directly, it can sometimes feel like whack-a-mole. And it's an endless battle. And biodynamics has a way to try to approach these ideas a little more indirectly, and you might say holistically. So I'm going to start with a recitation from Rilke here, because what we're dealing with, it's pretty serious stuff, and some of it can feel a bit heavy. So I'm going to start with a quote. Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the angelic orders? And even if one of them reached down and pressed me suddenly to his heart, I'd be consumed in his greater existence. For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, which we can just barely endure. As we stand in awe of it, it coolly disdains to destroy us. Every angel is terrifying. When we think of pests, we tend to think of something like a weed, something that's where we don't want it. And that, as Steiner says in the agriculture course, that in itself doesn't get us very far. What we need to start to understand is a more holistic context of the conditions that come into play when we're talking about a pest, and why is a pest there in the first place. The simplest way to think about it is that everything, whether it's a virus, whether it's bacteria, whether it's a human being, we all survive in actually a relatively narrow bandwidth of conditions. If we increase the temperature of Earth a number of degrees, it becomes uninhabitable for human beings. If we do the same thing to a virus within the body, it likewise is forced out through a benevolent fever. The same thing can be applied to pests within the garden. And it's only by coming at it with that kind of attitude that we can really get a grasp on what a pest really means in the garden. And when we start to see that every pest requires a certain set of conditions, rather than attacking the pest directly, we can try to start to address the conditions that are favorable for fostering that. There's this concept that Steiner brings in the agriculture course, and it can be a bit confusing. On the left here, I have a depiction of the moon. On the right, the symbol for Saturn. This can get a little confusing because sometimes Steiner says moon and he means the moon among all of the planets. Sometimes Steiner says moon and he means moon as shorthand for the inner planets. And that can get confusing. So a part of a way to clarify this is to think of moon as kind of the wet, moist, earthy things. And if there's an excess of that, you're going to end up with things like mildew or fungus. You might have more slugs in that case. On the other hand, what Steiner associates with Saturn is more of the conditions on the other pole, things that get too dry, it's too airy. The soil warms up too much, and cold-blooded pests like flea beetles will thrive. It's understanding that polarity. It's not about the words you use. You could use any words really. This is shorthand because we have to work with something. But understanding those as two polarities is really helpful. In Rudolf Steiner's work, Man as Symphony of the Creative Word, he refers to what he calls Sun-Saturn, so the influences of Saturn working with the sun, as warm air. So if we keep that in mind, the Saturn makes a bit more sense, and then the moon makes a bit more sense. The moon is when the earth stays moist and damp, when it's raining outside, you can't see the sun. You could refer that to, metaphorically speaking, the moon. When we look at a balanced plant, a plant is surrounded with the conditions that it wants. Here, I'm actually going to try to show you. This is, you could say, the bandwidth of the possible living conditions for, right here, let's call it a beet. It can live all the way over to here. It can live all the way over here. It can be wet. It can be dry. And somewhere in the middle is the ideal location for that. But if it becomes too extreme in any direction, you're going to see pests arise. For example, if it gets too dry or too warm, you're going to end up with flea beetles. Flea beetles, like I said, are cold-blooded animals, so they need constantly to be surrounded by warmth. I'm using the same color here as a kind of shorthand again for Saturn. All of those warm air qualities. A flea beetle cannot survive unless it has outer warmth. When it comes to your plants, that may mean that the soil itself has become too warm. And that means that it's not shaded enough, or it dried out, and that further facilitated it warming up. In addition, maybe you just have a sandier soil, so air gets into it a lot easier, and therefore it warms up easier. Or maybe you have beds. All of these factors need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at these pests. The important part in this diagram, though, is that you see there's overlap. This is when we get the pest as a problem. And this is where the pest would win. The problem here is that people tend to blame the pest for moving the beet outside of its comfort zone, but the truth is the conditions of the soil were already such that the pest could win. In this case, if you see this flea beetle problem overtaking your plants, in biodynamic talk, you might say that the plant lacks ethericity, so it's being scavenged by these other pests. Etheric and ethericity can sound like strange words, but if you replace them in your mind with something like vitality, anything that's alive, growing, able to heal, reproduce, that is life, and that's what we mean when we talk about ethericity or etheric qualities within the soil. In the case of, say, something like a beet, it would mean that there's not enough compost, or there's not enough manure, or there's not enough water. Any of these things that are somehow throttling its growth so that the pests are eating it faster than it can grow, that's where you have that problem. And that's what you see here is where the pests are starting to win, and it pushes it off the side of the screen. And the plant itself may not even be able to survive. If you plant a beet over on this condition to the left of the screen, it's not going to survive, and it will look like the flea beetles destroyed it, but the truth is you might have planted it outside of the conditions where beets could thrive in the first place. So you're going to begin to see that it's this overlap. That's all we're thinking about. And if we can shift the conditions of the beet just a little bit to the right, the flea beetle no longer is a problem. That is the fundamental idea of balancing these pests with biodynamics. And yeah, you can use certain preparations, you can use certain herbs, but it's this mentality of just shifting conditions so it's no longer hospitable for the pest. If you go to the right, this is an example when you have actually not excessive Saturn, where the soil has warmed up too much and there's not enough shade on it. On the right, you have what you call excessive moon, where you get mildew and fungus, these damp qualities on the leaves. You might have slugs show up. And you can see also there's this overlap. This is the place where a beet can survive with the green, and this is the bandwidth where the mildew and fungus can survive. And again, the trick would just be moving it slightly to the left. So you can see that there's this healthy bandwidth in the middle where, yeah, there'll be some flea beetles that show up. They'll take a bite here, a bite there. Maybe a little spot of mildew will show up on a part of the leaf that's, damper than the rest. But the plant itself is unimpeded, and it's actually able to grow more vigorously under this pressure. One thing that a lot of organically minded people don't realize about mild pest pressure is that when a pest takes a nibble out of a plant, and I don't mean shredding it to bits, but when there are these tiny little holes out of it, it actually causes the plant to flush that leaf with antioxidants and nutrients, sort of like as an emergency response. So when you see tiny nibbles on your plant, that actually means you have a more nutrient-dense food. And so it's actually better if you have minor flaws in your produce than if you have immaculate produce like you can sometimes find in grocery stores, not to mention the pesticides they use to get it there. So this is the context. you want to grow a beet or any plant right in the middle. On the left, you have an excess of Saturn forces, or those warm air forces. On the right, you have the opposite. You have too much water, too much dampness, stagnant air. And these two polarities are really what we're playing with here. There are ways to tease it out so it's a little more diverse, but this is the way to think about it. In the middle, you have the sun working between the two of these, and that is the happy spot. When you're able to find that balance right at the heart, that is what we're after in terms of pest management. We have to think, though, in terms of where these different organisms would thrive. You could actually go so far as to say you want to think about what it would take if you wanted to raise the pest for yourself. What if you wanted to raise it as a crop? Let's say you wanted to raise flea beetles, I don't know, as some sort of bait. Or let's say you wanted to grow fungus in order to grow mushrooms or something. If you study the conditions that would be favorable to produce these on scale, and then say, all right, that's exactly the conditions I have to eliminate, and eliminate all of the ones that you can without also eliminating the conditions required for the healthy crop that you're after. But this is the mentality. This isn't going to give you a solution for every single discrete pest, but it will give you tools for looking at the pest as a sign and help you nudge these conditions just a little bit back towards center. Sometimes that's all that's required. So there's going to be a contrast here. Some of you may be dealing with perennials, some may be dealing with annuals, some people may be a little with both. But in the case of a perennial tree, you're going to see that Saturn, or the warm air, has taken over more strongly. You're going to see that frost is less likely to take hold under a tree. You're going to see that these are fascinating creatures, really, where they're able to accumulate askal substance and hardened bark around them, whereas your tender annual plants simply don't. Steiner refers to the soil around a tree as having a poverty of ethericity. And this has proven itself to be true. If you dig below the leaf litter layer of your soil in a forest, you get to this really dusty, airy kind of forest soil. And it's actually poorer in organic matter than a pasture. The pasture is the opposite. You're going to see leafy growth on the surface, and the topsoil is going to seem relatively poor in organic matter. But the deeper you go in grassland, the more organic matter you'll find. And in this case, we can kind of say that the organic matter is kind of like moon forces, whereas Saturn is more of the atmospheric forces. Everything that pertains to the moon and the inner planets is what has to go into the soil first in order to come up. So I like to think of it as your manures, your salts, your fertilizers, the rainwater itself. You can't, like, rain falling on the leaves of plants doesn't help them very much. It has to go into the soil and then come up. Those, for me, are the inner planets. And their meaning has to do with your geology and your climate altogether. Above, with the ripening forces, you're going to see is Saturn. And you want this to be surrounding the plant and interacting in a beautiful way. And you're going to have elements of both in the soil, which is where you can kind of see it's not just blue, and it's not just the color of Saturn either. When you look to a tree, you're going to find grubs that live on its roots. And that's where they naturally like to live. Steiner talks about this 4-year cycle in nature, and he refers to grubs at a certain point. And someone asked a question about grubs on potatoes. And if you're just reading quickly through it, you're missing that he's talking about the same thing each time he says that. This 4-year cycle, these grubs on the roots of potatoes, for example. In this case, it's the cockchafer grub. The cockchafer grub moves over to something that's not normally its habitat. Why does it do that? It does that because you've turned your garden soil into something that reminds it of its forest soil habitat. So below the ground, you have these cockchafer grubs, and then above, you have them as adults, and they feed on oak leaves. And this is a natural cycle, and this is where they would honestly prefer to live. They only displace themselves from the roots when you've created soil conditions somewhere else that's just like their forest soil, just like their favorite conditions. So if you don't want them to have a buffet on your potatoes can't have so much, so to speak, Saturn in the soil. The soil can't be too warm, too airy, too light. It needs to be darkened, watered, and made heavier So the tendency with potatoes is because people are mounding them up, they're over-fining it, they're over-tilling it, and by doing that, the overworking reduces it to dust, and that dust becomes very much like a forest soil. And then you end up with cockchafer grubs moving and saying, well, I'll eat your potatoes then. But the interesting thing about the cockchafer grub is it has to be surrounded not by this richness of ethericity or moon forces, but rather it must be surrounded by the conditions of warmth that you find underneath a tree. So if you're beginning to see how some of this gets into managing pests, I'll proceed. Again, feel free to interact with a question if something in particular is not clear. That's the best time for a question. If you have a specific application, we may postpone that to a question and answer session, but if you have something that is needs dire explanation, feel free to interrupt with a chat or raise your hand. On the right here, you see a tender annual plant in its proper formation. And here, you're going to have, instead of the cockchafer grubs, you're going to see earthworms. What Steiner says about earthworms is kind of beautiful. He says they leave behind the perfect ethericity for plant growth, which is the perfect vitality. And they act as these kind of release valves for excessive ethericity in the soil. If there's too much, that would lead to things like fungal problems on the leaves of plants. But you've got earthworms, they kind of digest it and let it release. What the earthworms eat are the root hairs around plants. This doesn't actually harm the plant itself, but they feed off of it. This is why when you dig up a root and you look at the soil around it, you're actually going to find, particularly in weeds, at least you'll find an earthworm. And that's its home. It lives there just like the cockchafer grub lives off the tender roots of oaks. So the earthworm, which is itself much softer, lives off the even softer root hairs of your annual plants. And it all comes back to the plants. The plants are building the soil, and yes, the earthworm is a wonderful thing to have in the soil, but it is another animal that is breaking things down and digesting them, whereas the plant is drawing in new sunlight and new substance to the soil every year. The correspondent in the plant world, the annual plant world, to something like the cockchafer grubs or birds would be butterflies. And you'll see this softening as you get towards the annual realm. So on the left here would be an example of a beet that has developed beet nematodes. I'll write that down for anyone who had this. Can't see this. Beet nematodes. This is where you develop these little swellings around the roots, and they're really unpleasant to have. But this is a place where, again, the balance of Saturn forces has way overweighed the moon forces in the soil. This would be, again, a case where you've overworked the soil. You've tilled it to dust. There's no more structure. The organic matter is gone. The plants haven't grown fast enough to shade the roots around themselves, or maybe it's just so dry that the heat has penetrated too deeply. Unfortunately, because these pests have this 4-year cycle, if you want to break it, you really have to address a problem consistently for 4 years. The pest problem you're having now is actually because of something you did probably 4 years ago that happened in the soil, and they've been growing, gestating, and then they manifest those years later. So pest management really is about managing the soil and the conditions around the plants and doing that consistently over time. On the right here, we have the opposite condition. This is where you're going to see fungus. And in particular, this is where the moon forces have just become predominant. You're going to have, let's say you put too much manure, too much nitrogen. It's been a really wet winter followed by a wet spring. This leads to really lush green growth, which is not what you want. At a beet, you would just see ballooning leaves, whereas on the left, when you have beet nematodes, you see wilting leaves. These are polar conditions that you can actually manage by thinking about this in the same way. When you have that excessive wateriness, the plant actually develops in a really negative way, at least for itself. It's a really benevolent way if you want to grow fungus. So what happens is this layer of soil where all the fungus should grow, moves up here. This has become so watery that the leaves themselves to fungus feel like another type of soil. Steiner refers to it as a second layer of soil. And in this condition, you have a real problem because these are the astral influences. This is the air, light, and warmth that would lead to ripening, to sweetening, to nourishment. These are actually separated from the plant. There's almost a divorce that occurs there. Whereas the moon forces are not interacting properly on the plant with the left because the leaves can't stay fleshy and green and perky. On the right, you have the opposite problem where the environmental conditions can't intervene properly with the plant, so the plant can't develop the way it should. So there are a couple questions, and I'll read them out. Someone's asking, what's the best way to prepare a site before you plant? Someone just beginning a biodynamic journey. One of the best ways would probably be to deep rip with a broad fork, and then begin with something like the Pfeiffer field spray or 500 XP, as it might be said. That's one of the best ways to get it going. In addition to that, I would follow that immediately with whatever kind of cover crop you can find that will survive the following season. If you're growing just for vegetables now, I'd bring in as much compost as you can. Pfeiffer's recommendations are as much as 10 tons per acre. So you can scale that down to whatever size plot you have, and that's the beginning. Deep rip or broad fork, and then spray 500 XP or Pfeiffer field spray. That's a very good way to begin. Someone's asking, how do you dry the soil out when it just keeps on raining, as it has been, or someone's asking this question. Maria Toon actually addresses some ways to deal with this. If it's been perpetual rain, you're kind of in trouble. But if you have breaks of the rain, if you cultivate and hoe around your plants in the morning by breaking that soil up and you increase the surface area, and then as the sun rises, it warms the soil and it's able to steam off. You can do the opposite by hoeing in the evening if you've had droughts, and that will actually allow that evening dew to precipitate within the soil. So there are ways to manage your water dynamically or biodynamically just by knowing these rhythms. I think that will help. In addition to that, you would probably want to use equisetum arvens. If you have excessive rainfall and consistently excessive rainfall, equisetum arvens, you have to let off that excessive vitality and allow the plants to survive for themselves. If you look at the life habit of equisetum arvens or horsetail, you're going to see that it's quite content with having waterlogged roots. If you take that plant, make a tea out of it, and water in your other plants with it, those plants also become tolerant of water standing around their roots. I'm being asked a question of how do you treat pear rust. Pear rust actually belongs to the condition on the right. The condition on the right is one where you have maybe it's a high rainfall area and there's a wet winter that leads to this problem expressing itself in the tree. That is, again, an equisetum arvens tendency. In addition to that, you might consider broad forking around the tree in spring to kind of let out some of that extra water. You want to allow it to breathe out. It has too much moon forces, and you need to bring something Saturnine like equisetum to bear, or crack the soil open so the air and light can get down into the roots. That's one of the direct ways. Someone's asking, is biodynamics okay with laying down lime? Yes, absolutely. Steiner never prohibited the use of traditional methods. He said to continue fertilizing and amending your soil as you were, and to incorporate this way of seeing things and these preparations in addition. So using lime is not a problem. No, Steiner even recommends certain kinds. He preferred dolomite, but he also makes recommendations for things like quicklime. So he's not at all adverse to that in the least. I'm going to get to the slugs in a little bit, but I'm going to continue briefly if that's all right. Remind me, but earthworms act here. when you have excessive ethericity, you end up almost with an anaerobic soil. So the organic matter builds up because the oxygen's not there to burn off the carbohydrates. It can't do anything with them. Well, the earthworms, because they have their own internalized system where they can come out to breathe when they need to, they go down and develop into the soil, and they consume the excessive ethericity and bring the plant back towards center. It kind of does a little bit like what the equisetum would do. You can just force the soil to do what you want. Someone's asking when you get time how to get a more acid soil. You would use things based on sulfur, the opposite pole of lime. So if you know you have certain conditions in your soil and you know you're deficient in copper and zinc, as you probably are, knowing knowing where you are, you could use zinc sulfate, copper sulfate. Those are ways to make a soil more acidic, but also to provide those key trace nutrients at the same time. And once you've done that properly and balanced it, you'll see that a lot of the conditions because of the pH will resolve themselves. Here in this plant, you see the two are working together well. Here, where's the moon? The leaves can't ripen up properly. There's no proper swelling of the root other than these unnatural nodules. On the right, you see the astrality is pushed away from the plant and it won't photosynthesize properly. It's big leaves, but they're not sweet. In the middle, you have a more modestly shaped leaf. It's more balanced with the plant, and the full ripening photosynthetic effect can take place. In general, a lot of the plants you want to use are right on your garden. This is something you can do, is you can pull from some of the best medicinal weeds on your garden if you have something like bees, and use that as your smoke. I find that they're much more tolerant of that than just whatever you happen to be burning. It's far more aromatic, and they seem to be pleased by it. This is a similar kind of approach. Here's a good one. It's a quote from Paracelsus. "They want medicine from overseas, though better medicine grows in the garden right in front of their homes." See, Paracelsus was talking about eating locally hundreds of years ago. A lot of the plants that you need to correct the problems that you're seeing are already growing on your farm or in your garden. For example, if you have a lot of waterlogged problems that are leading to fungus, or you have slug problems, you're often going to find plants that can thrive in those exact same conditions without succumbing to the damp. Those plants, particularly if they're a known medicinal plant, will be helpful. In the case of slugs, you're dealing with something of not just moon forces in the soil, you're dealing with that humidity and those moon forces throughout the air. So you're dealing with a different condition. So simply applying equisetum to the soil is not necessarily going to do what you want in the case of slugs. It wouldn't hurt to apply it directly to the plants so that they're not going to get fungus from those conditions, but you're going to have a problem with the slug. The first thing that can help is mounding up your plants, however slightly, just so it's above the average level. When you have them mounded up, they're going to dry out faster, so will the leaves. And in addition to that, the slugs won't have that blanket fog that rolls in every evening. No matter where you are, even if it's a desert, that cool evening air that comes rolling in is almost always at 100% saturation. So if you can put the plants up just a little so they can peek their heads up and above that, that can help with the slug issue. In addition to that, Steiner specifically recommends taking the seeds from pine, crushing them to get the juice, and using that as a kind of deterrent against the slug. Again, though, that is another Saturn-governed plant. It's a very aromatic plant, and you could use other ones. For example, when you get really dampness in the air, what happens when we live in air that's just too damp, or we're recirculating our own damp air? We get conditions a bit like pneumonia. So if you look to the herbs that would be good for clearing the lungs of dampness, that would be something to use, or not just use, plant around your slug-prone plants. For example, I plant Tulsi and Calendula all around my squash, through my tomatoes. So I have these really high essential oil plants radiating their influence everywhere. And that is really, like, I mean, these creatures hate it. Squash bugs don't like it. The, the, the slugs themselves don't like it. And it's a way of actually like clarifying the air itself. So yeah, it's still humid, but now you have the essential oils there too. So that is a deterrent for most of these nocturnal pests. I've got some more questions. I'm going to look back there for a second. Let's see. Can you address the unnatural conditions of a greenhouse, specifically the issue with aphids and whiteflies? Predator insects are often not effective enough, neither are organic materials. Yeah. The problem in a greenhouse is that you're blocking the influence of Saturn, so to speak. The air can warm up, but it can't dry out. So better circulation, even if it means you have to add some sort of vent at the top so it can continually steam off instead of condensing and then falling back in, condensing and falling back in. If you allow it to go up and vent out, a lot of the moon problems will go away. And the aphids really are like that. Steiner refers to aphids as being this organism that's almost all flower, which is a very curious way to put it. But you're ending up with this flowering process happening on the leaves of the plants, and you don't want that. There's this refinement of juices that are coming out of the leaves, and that's what the aphids come after. The aphids themselves, again, are also a symptom. So you need to bring to bear certain other Saturn-governed things. So the eucalyptus would help. In this case, a nasturtium would help. And this might just mean that you're growing a lot of nasturtiums in the greenhouse around the plants, or you can make a ferment or a tea out of the nasturtiums and use that as a spray. It's one of the best remedies through an orchard or just around other garden plants against aphids specifically. You're just altering the conditions enough that the aphids don't find it hospitable. It doesn't mean they'll all go away. That's really not the aim with biodynamics, but they no longer are a pest. Someone else is asking. Someone says, I have oakworm on my fruit trees, leaves, and new fruit. My orchard has oak trees around it. Any suggestions for treatment? In that case, I would actually have to think more about that. If you can feel free to email me at perennialroots@gmail.com. If there's anything I can't answer here, I'll do my best to try to answer later, if that's okay. Some of this I just haven't looked into or don't have experience with. Someone's asking calendula and which around squash, tulsi, any high essential oil herb. I like the high essential oil annual herbs. Someone's asking about problems with straw bales for mulch. The glyphosate could be a concern. If you can find unsprayed straw, that's even better. But in itself, the problem with using straw bales over and over, or even wood chips, is you're going to end up with a potassium excess. That can be counterbalanced if you're bringing in animal manures, because they tend to bring the phosphorus pole. Potassium belongs on the lime pole, phosphorus and sulfur on the other, and you'll need to balance that. If you just keep trucking in manure, you end up with a phosphorus excess. If you keep trucking in wood chips, you're going to end up with potassium excess. It's about balancing those. Someone says that there's a huge problem with aphids on kale and chard, cucumber beetles on squash and cucumber starts. Yeah, in this case, you may have a problem with what is being fed to the plants themselves. If a plant is being fed compost that is not in itself free of odor, particularly when you start to get to some of those brassicas, if you feed plants manure that smells, the plants themselves radiate a kind of stink that all of the pests and insects detect and come rushing towards. So it's like a beacon, so to speak, on the astral plane. All of these insects come rushing forward because it smells like food. So we want an odorless compost as much as we can, an odorless manure before we put it on the crops. And that's part of how do you have to manage some of these. Again, when you deal with some of these cucumber beetles or the aphids, you'll want to plant close to them other plants that are really tolerant of the same conditions, something like nasturtiums, because that will help deter the aphids, move things away. And just by being planted with their roots connecting to your cucumbers, the cucumbers themselves actually start to circulate some of the same compounds that were in the nasturtiums. Um, going to briefly go through the making of this equisetum decoction, because this is going to be a remedy for almost all of these conditions people are mentioning about mold, black rot, these wet conditions. Equisetum arvense is really going to help with those. It's not a direct attack against the fungus, though the sulfur in it doesn't hurt. It's about relieving that extra water. It has a diuretic effect, and so to speak, it allows your plants to urinate, allows them to relieve themselves of excess water. Someone's asking about, yeah, the peach leaf curl, the fungal spots, the black mold and rot, all of these belong to that excessive moon force. So you want to bring that back to center by letting out that excessive wateriness, whatever that is, and that is going to be equisetum arvense. That is one of the best remedies. And you can end up with squash that gets no powdery mildew, particularly if you use that as a preventative. Let's see. Someone's asking, would the nasturtium tea work on white aphids that feed on brassicas as well? Yes. Yes, it would. And some of these, like the slug issue, the slugs are from stagnant humid air. And it's very similar to conditions that happen with the mold and fungus and things like that. Sometimes this means you need to space your rows a little more to get air circulation around the problem plants. And again, if you mound them up, even if it's just 6 inches, that's enough to peak their heads up above the surface and allow them to have a slightly drier atmosphere. Think about going up a mountain. By the time you get to the top, it's a really rarefied atmosphere. You're not going to have the same kind of slug problems there as you will down towards the coast, like where I am, if that makes sense. Equisetum works well on soil to relieve what's there on the soil. You can do it directly to the plant. If the plant is suffering, you can use it as a foliar spray. For trees, it's a little trickier, and I'm going to get to that a little later, but that will be involved with tree paste. You can put it in the tree paste and apply it to the bark. Yes. Someone's asking, are there any herbs to plant in places next to fruit that may be prone to black rot, as well as the treatment as suggested? I would, again, focus on anything that is especially aromatic. I would plant around the trees stinging nettle in particular. Stinging nettle will help against things like aphids. It will balance the soil. Earthworms show up more vigorously than anything you can imagine. Just growing nettles near trees has a wonderful effect. It also attracts all sorts of wasps. It's great. I would plant nettle there and other high essential oil herbs. Valerian in particular might be something of benefit in your case. A lot of people talk about using these biodynamic herbs and spraying them on the plants. You could also plant them around the trees, plant them around your shrubs, so that they just have the influence just by their roots melding and trading through the mycorrhizal network. So I'm going to go through this equisetum recipe. You take equisetum. You can order it in bulk if you need it. It's better if you can grow it. You put it in a pot and let it simmer covered for 45 minutes to an hour. You let that cool. You bottle that up. You put it aside somewhere where it can ferment. And you do that for 7 to 10 days. You can leave it longer. You might need to activate it again by making some fresh tea, pouring it in. It wakes right back up. But once you've let that ferment, it is far stronger than if you use the straight tea. Lily Kalisko did comparisons using just a straight, fresh equisetum tea versus the fermented equisetum tea, and hands down, the fermented version was much better. It's best to harvest the equisetum before it's produced its sort of flowering, fruiting heads. You want it young. Yeah, and someone asked, it's supposed to smell really bad? Yes. And here's my reasoning for it. Whenever an animal is alive, it shouldn't stink. It will smell like chicken. It will smell like dog. You'll smell like a human. There's pheromones meant to attract a mate, but you're not meant to stink. And that goes for something like equisetum. But what we're doing is we have removed the organizing principle altogether. The organizing principle here that you can see in its form, we destroy, we strain it, and then we ferment it. So without that organizing principle there to close in the scent, it is meant to release its scent because we want to be able to give it to whatever plant we pour it on. So it should stink. This is different from the farm as a living organism or compost as an odorless thing. That's supposed to be odorless because we don't want our plants to be stinking and attracting pests from all around. In this case, because this is a remedy, we want it to stink. We want it to have given itself up and just be radiating its influence so you can pour it directly on your plants. You can water this in, even at full strength, around squash or anything that's showing these problems, and you'll do quite well. You can dilute the equisetum spray. I diluted about 9 parts water to 1 part fermented equisetum, and you can stir that a little bit. And but it doesn't need to be stirred a ton, like 5 to 10 minutes. That's probably enough. You can potentize it for a full hour if you want a really strong effect, but most people aren't going to do that, and I don't think it's entirely necessary. In terms of stirring, it's a law of diminishing returns. The first 5, 10, 20 minutes, you get 80% of the effect of the hour stir, and then it declines after that. There may be other reasons for continuing, but yeah, I'm going to answer another couple questions. Someone here is asking, do you treat both the soil and plant each time? It depends. If you're dealing with a fungal problem that's just because of moist air, not because of too much water in the soil, you're probably going to do a foliar spray because that's where the problem is. If, on the other hand, you know it's been too damp and the plant is waterlogged and that's causing fungal problems above, you would treat both at the same time, if that makes sense. Stinging nettles are still useful once they go to seed, but you don't want to consume stinging nettles after they've flowered because they produce a compound that can aggravate kidney stones. Up until the point that they flowered, they're fine, or even if you mow it down and there's new growth, you can eat that, but you don't want them after that, at least for human consumption. You can still use it in your garden, but I just like to include the warning there. Someone's asking about mammals, skunks and raccoons. That's going to come a little later, if that's okay. We'll have to address that, if that's all right. Whitefly belongs to some of these others, but these general principles are what we're trying to look at, not the specific pest per se. And we'll proceed if that's all right. Here's the stinging nettles. This plant contains all essential amino acids plus some other non-essentials. It has calcium, iron, magnesium, good grief, the number of things in this single plant. You understand why Steiner refers to this as a sort of jack of all trades. This is a real balancer. This balances the astral and the etheric, which is why I'm bringing this in here. This is more of, I almost like to think of this as a sun plant, balancing the moon and Saturn. So this plant, if you ferment this and use this through your garden, if you have something that is too much Saturn or too much moon, this brings it to center. It's a wonderful plant. You do want to dilute it because of the high protein nitrogen content. You can burn your plants. So again, just dilute it, 9 parts water to 1 part of fermented nettle, and you can spray this out. I'm going to proceed if that's okay. Otherwise, I feel like we might not get through this whole slide. I'm going to have to proceed if that's okay. If we can get to some more of these questions, we'll keep going. The stinging nettle you can make into a preparation by collecting the nettle, letting it wilt a little bit, packing it into like a clay flue tile, and this you then allow to be buried for a full year. So there's some prep work that goes into this, but once you've done that, you've allowed it to digest into such a state that you only need a pinch of this, and you can stir that in water and spray it over your plants, particularly ones you want to improve in flavor. And I really think this amazing plant, because of all those essential amino acids, it is no surprise to me that you spray this on the plants. This is the one biodynamic preparation that consistently, through Pfeiffer's research, showed an improvement of flavors. No surprise to me at all. Someone asked, do you ferment the nettle in the same way? For this is a year-long kind of like dry aging process. You can do a ferment the same way as the nettle. Same way as the equisetum. I would actually say you don't need to boil it in that case. Just stuff a bunch of fresh nettle in a bucket, put it somewhere where you're going to walk every day. Don't put it too near the kitchen. It smells terrible. and put a stick in it, and every time you pass, just give it a light stir, just to keep it agitated. It'll digest very quickly, and then you can use it on your garden. The heavy feeders, like squash, tomato, most of the nightshades, some kinds of kale and spinach, will tolerate a much stronger concentration of nettle. Other things, you're going to want to be a little more careful with it because it's very strong. This is going to get to just an idea of a general remedy, because if we think of each of these pests as something separate, again, it will feel like whack-a-mole perpetually in the garden. But the nice thing is that Steiner tells us that there are actually general remedies against ailments that trouble plants in the first place. I'm going to read this quote out for anyone who's calling in. If you could not apply a general remedy against plant disease, you would be in a position as difficult as trying to heal animals. Above all, plant diseases are not processes like those in sick human beings. A real disease is not possible without the presence of an astral body. Now, what is an astral body? Well, here's the thing. If you look at a plant needs the environment to provide warmth. It needs the environment to provide light. We still need that to an extent, obviously, but we have an internalized climate where we're able to keep ourselves a bit warmer than the environment and a bit cooler than the environment. Plant doesn't have that fully internalized process, at least as much as mammals or human beings. And because of that, the diseases that we see in plants aren't because of its internal climate being messed up. It's because of the surrounding conditions. So we always have to look outside the plant to see what's wrong with the plant itself. And fortunately, Steiner suggests that there is a general remedy against plant disease like fungus and excessive ethericity. And he refers to this as oak bark. And it's a good thing that we have that, because otherwise we would be constantly having to deal with each one of these different plants and each one of these different diseases. And instead there's this idea of a single remedy. All right. Now, this is getting to the tree part that someone referenced. And this is where you can apply equisetum fermented. You can mix it with raw manure and clay. And I like to mix in the other biodynamic preparations as well, at least something like the Pfeiffer Field spray or something like 500 XP. Just mix those things together really well and then coat the tree. It may seem odd, but Michael Phillips, who wrote The Holistic Orchard, I found this quote from him. And he says, biodynamic tree paste isn't bull, but I can understand your asking. The manure introduces beneficial organisms, and the clay has long been noted as a skin rejuvenator. Tree paste should help deter perennial canker, especially as this fungal infection must renew itself yearly. A manure pack on bacteria-laden bark crevices will check some fire blight before it spreads. So this is another way to approach that. In particular, to take into mind that idea of fire blight or these rust diseases or fungus on the leaves are all due to an excess of humidity, an excess of moon forces. That is, as a general remedy, you're going to use something like equisetum. Again, equisetum is a kidney plant that allows you and your organism to relieve excessive water. This allows the plants to do the same. So I would use a strong concentration of equisetum, particularly if you're having fungal issues in an orchard or a vineyard or on berries. Use a strong mixture of this. If you have something like berries or vineyard, it's going to be harder to paint this on every single branch. You could mix this and dilute it and use backpack sprayer to spray everywhere that you want it to be. And you might do several applications because you can't do as thick of a paste across everything. This is almost like a poultice for the different trees. Dennis Kloschek refers to tree pasting, I think, is almost like as an esoteric deed. And at least in terms of intent and visualization, you are giving that plant more attention than it probably is ever going to receive throughout the rest of the year. When you bother to, by hand, go through and feel the contours of the bark and how the branches separate, there's something beneficial just to going through that process. In addition to it, you're going to notice things about that plant that you wouldn't have seen otherwise, that I can't give you the answer to because you haven't seen it before. But by bringing your attention to that plant, you will see more than you would otherwise. Back to oak bark preparation, which is an unusual preparation for some. Um, Steiner refers to this particular one with some fondness. He says that trees characteristically surround themselves with bark, and the bark of oak trees and willows is most effective because the astral comes in most strongly. But all trees that contain tannic acid, as we call it, are trees where the astral has come in strongly. It acts as a sort of antidote, because with this, one can throw out again from the astral body what has come into it as plant poison. So again, if you have the basically toxic effects in a plant due to too much water, too much manure, too much of whatever those conditions are, you can use something like oak bark, something with those tannins, that astringent drying quality, to help dry the plant out. And that is the focus of the oak bark preparation. Though I will say, if you don't have oaks, Steiner here is suggesting that you could use willows, because willows have nearly as much, the salic species have nearly as much calcium. Everybody likes to quote a number about oak bark, 77% calcium. Well, all barks tend to have over 50% calcium, so that's a lot. And then when you get to the willows, you're into the 70s as well. So Steiner recommends oak bark and willow bark indiscriminately as treatment for asthma. So it's worth keeping that in mind when looking at what this remedy means and how you would use it. Just barks in general. Now, for a plant you want to remain succulent and tender and sweet like lettuce, you maybe won't use as much oak bark on that, because it will make the plant taste oaky. For something that's clearly rotting from fungus, you're not going to hurt it. But this is, again, it's always a balancing act. Yeah, this is directed from the agriculture course, and Steiner says, when we look at an herb growing on the ground, it is surrounded by a cloud of astrality. But on a tree, this astrality is so much denser because the trees are great accumulators of astral substance. And this is where you can see, yeah, you'll get some woody bits forming on your annual plants. Yeah, the grass will turn brown in the fall, but it doesn't form wood the same way, and it doesn't get that bark to it. There's a very different process happening in that tree that really has to be understood if you're going to think of pests and disease in trees versus pests and disease in annuals. This is some of the oak bark we collected. We grind that up, and we put that into the skull of a domesticated animal. Why that? Well, you could use other approaches. In this case, it's because it's here, it's available, it's on the farm, it's something you can do yourself, so that the farm, from its own resources, can almost make an antidote without having to draw from things outside the farm. And that's really the radical aspect of biodynamics, is that it's showing you ways that on almost any farm, you can find resources to address the problems. When it comes down to it, all of this centers around carbon. And this is where it's going to get a little unusual. We're going to get into some odd ideas, but Steiner, if you'll forgive me, talks about alchemy, and he says that carbon was the philosopher's stone all along, and that the alchemists hid this. In a way, you could see that how in China, the alchemists knew all about carbon in terms of creating explosives. There were some prototypes of rifles, even repeat fire machine guns, and then it got suppressed and got redirected into making beautiful fireworks. And if you follow Steiner's conjecture there, it would be almost like they knew that this could be used for terrible things and said, let's move it into entertainment rather than war. And Steiner said the alchemists kept the secrets about carbon. I think everything's carbon: wood, fuel, plastics, your coal, gasoline, all of these things are carbon. They kept this secret because in the wrong hands, it could be used for terrible things. In our time, it already is being used for these terrible things. So now the rest of us basically have to become alchemists in order to access the healing properties of carbon. And that's what soil building is, carbon sequestration. That's what composting is. And it's really, honestly, it's a sacred thing, and it's a duty that we have to the earth. So we're going to get back to slugs. So someone will be happy. This here is a slug. Everybody probably knows that if you take a salt shaker and pour salt on a slug, it doesn't really like that. In fact, the slug will shrivel up and then die. This principle is what the following sequence is going to be about. And you need to keep this idea of the slug in mind. The slug and what salt does to its body is what these biodynamic pest remedies can do directly to the pest. So there's some questions I just haven't been able to address so far about specific pests, and some people asked about mammals. This is where we're going to get to that. What this salt does to the slug's body is what you can do to every plant or every animal's own etheric body, so to speak. When you're out for a long day and you don't drink enough water and you get dehydrated, you get that headache, you're tired, you're fatigued, your urine will turn darker. It's not a pleasant experience to be dehydrated. That feeling is when your water body, your flowing etheric body, is deficient, and that is really what we're going to target with this next sequence. And this is the alchemy side of pest management with biodynamics. And this is where, if you just, for example, you have a climatic problem or just an environmental issue, or just the animals are there, you can't do anything to fix it because their habitat is all around your garden. If that's the case, you can start to make your plants taste bad to them. You can start to do this to them. And what it will do is kind of make them feel dehydrated. It'll make them feel tired. And if you continue it over time, it will actually decrease the rate of reproduction, and they won't want to be there. And we'll get into exactly how we do that. So let's see, right here. This quote gets into how to deal with weeds and pests. And I'm going to read it in full. It says seeds, but imagine it could also say a pest. It could mean your squash bug. It could mean a slug. It could mean a flea beetle. It could mean ragweed. It doesn't matter which it is. Every plant and being carries within itself the germ of its own annihilation. Just as water is a requirement for fertility, on the one hand, so fire is a destroyer of fertility. This is kind of the Saturn-Moon conflict we were talking about earlier. That balance. Fire consumes fertility. Because seed power obviously continues to work after it is sown, so too the seed ash that you make from a weed has a similar far-reaching effect of annihilation. And this is a pretty radical idea. But the idea is that you take a pest, let's say a slug, and you collect enough of them. The best way to collect them, I find, is in some high-proof alcohol like Everclear. You just collect them, drop them in alcohol, and until you get enough, and enough is as many as you can get, you pass them through fire, and then you create the opposite of that. What you've really created, though in biodynamics they call it pepper, really it should be called salt, because you've reduced it to this almost white ash. And when you do that, these are all the salts of that animal, which frankly aren't going to taste good to that animal if it's fed back to them. You use this around your garden, you put this in your compost, you feed this back to the plants, and over time, it's, if a plant consumes something and then it goes to the pest ends up recycling these same salts, the salts that really don't belong there to it, salts that in the right amount it's alive, but in a slightly higher amount they're tired. If you go again, they feel really bad, and then if you go further, their reproductive capacity ceases. Now, these are always free to go somewhere else, so you're not actually killing any of them, aside from the original amount that you collect. This deters them and sends them outwards. What it really does is it concentrates slug salt in the slug at a level that it doesn't want, and that causes it to be tired, the fatigue increases, and eventually its reproductive capacity is lessened. And you can put this through your soil, you can put this under your plants, you can put it in your compost, and over time this accumulates, and you end up pushing them out of the garden because they just go, I'm going to go somewhere else where I just feel better. A similar kind of effect Steiner refers to happening to human beings who live too near to a graveyard, and he refers to a village where a stream flowed through it. So like there's all these salts seeping into that water, and that's what people were using to feed their animals or themselves. And over time, the whole village just was sallow, sad, just pale, weak, and old. Like they weren't reproducing. And that same thing can happen with human beings. The same thing can happen with an animal. And that's what you really want to culture in your garden. If you have something like gophers or these burrowing animals, a good trick with that is to listen to what Pfeiffer wrote. Pfeiffer talks about this peasant tradition of collecting mole soil. So anywhere moles would dig up that soil, because moles are incontinent. They don't have a sphincter to control when they urinate, so they're dribbling their own salts everywhere they go. If you collect that and take that to your garden, it's wonderful for your garden. It will do no harm to you. But over time, it starts to smell like a public bathroom to each of those specific pests. So they're like, I don't want to have anything to do with that. It feels like somebody's already been there. So that's kind of what this process of this peppering, salting process would do. Someone asked, would the pepper work as well with the seed of the pest, as in squash bugs? I would try it with both. If you're able to collect both, do both. Yeah, with the egg of the animal, I would just, everything you can collect, drop it in alcohol, and then burn them all together. I see no reason why both wouldn't work. In the case of a mammal, you only need the skin of the animal. You could probably do the whole thing, but that's a lot to keep. So you can dry the skin, or you can store it in alcohol, and then when you have enough, burn them, and those ashes again return. A gentler way with mammals would be to collect whatever droppings they had and use that in your compost, because that's just instinctively a negative thing to them. So you could take flea beetle, pass it through fire in a bowl or something, so that you keep all of their ashes, and then you create a negative of that pest in itself. So, and then you feed that to your gardens. Yeah, you could do the same protocol for varroa mites. There's no reason you couldn't do that. In addition, I would probably, with varroa mites, and this is me speculating at this point, I would burn the varroa mites, get that, and I would be careful with it. But what I would do is I would burn it as well as I could, get it as white as I could, and let it cool, use a coffee filter, and pour distilled water over it, so that what filters out is just, it's almost clear. And I would use that water supplemented with some biodynamic herbs like chamomile and tea. Gunter Hauck has a recipe at Spikenard for supplementing the bees. I would use that varroa mite salt water together with some biodynamic herbs, and I would feed that to the bees. So the bees themselves are just infused with varroa mite salt. And I would bet good money that varroa mites would hate that like nothing else. Yeah, it would work on ants. It works on anything. You soak them in alcohol just to preserve them, and then you can pour them off. And the reason you use a high proof alcohol is because it will facilitate the burning, if that makes sense. Yeah, you could mix this with the varroa mite mixed with honey, not too much, or the honey will ferment. So you would need to either reduce it and then mix it in. So yeah, someone mentions there's a homeopathic remedy for varroa, and it's not too far from what this is. You're using the salt of it, feed it to the organism you want to protect, and that's your bees. I think the bees would be all about it. You might even be able to offer it to the bees, and then I would try ashing a bunch of them, putting it there in front of the hive, just see what the bees do, record it, because if something happened, I'd really want to see it. Someone says there's a rat problem in the chicken coop in the garden. Would it be a good idea to put rat pepper in their feeders? That might help. Rats, it's going to be trouble, because you're going to have to put it around a space so that they don't want to live around them or to come into the chicken coop either. And it's a big ordeal to have to think about that. But collect as many as you can. If you can skin them and save them, burn them all together and scatter them around. Some people talk about the timing. Someone's asking about the timing to burn these. That depends. With seeds, I would generally do it on the waning moon. Steiner says when it comes to these other organisms like mammals, you need to consider Venus. He talks about when Venus is behind the sun. So I would say some people disagree about what that means, but if astronomically behind the sun would be Venus as the evening star. And he says that in Scorpio. So that gives you very specific indications, though I'm not sure that's quite what Steiner means either. I would almost think that it has something more to do with the animal while it's in heat. So I take some of Steiner's indications in a very different way. So basically, in the breeding season, if you're able to catch a particular animal and you're able to burn it and then spread that out, that's how that in particular would approach it. And I've had some decent result with the pests. Steiner talks about different times of the year which will be better for different pests. Well, look at when they breed, and I think you'll find an interesting coincidence with some of Steiner's indications. If someone asks how long the pepper will last, how often should you put out the pepper? A nice thing about these peppers is they just make everything around it inhospitable. Like, for example, take your ticks, put them in alcohol until you have enough. You can burn them all at once. You could even create little vials, seal those up so they're airtight so that water is not getting into it. You could probably wear that on your person, and you would probably notice that fewer ticks would even want to be near you. I mean, it's like, think of it as like a honeymoon principle. Who wants to honeymoon at something like Auschwitz? I mean, it'd be terrible. And that's what these pests kind of feel like. It's awful, but no one would want to go picnic at the grave of their ancestor, probably. Maybe you would, but I wouldn't. So how long would it last? If you can keep it airtight, it lasts a while. If you put it through your compost, it persists. But again, there's like this, for different pests, it depends. You need to look at what their life cycle is, how many years it is, and basically just keep heading it off. Some of them will have, if you're in a warm season, they'll have 2 or 3 life cycles in a season. So you need to think not just annually, but with each reproductive wave of cycles. So like with ticks, if you get a wave of ticks first thing in spring, they kind of die back. It gets wet again, you get another one. I would catch those each time. And yeah, and I would burn them that way. So here, if you have something like the cockchafer grub, pass it through fire, again, it becomes opposite. You're creating a unique salt to combat this unique organism. And it's species specific. So it's not, if you burned a wild radish, it's not the same as burning the one in your garden. So that's a nice thing. You're not going to have conflicts because of this. So here's an interesting quote from another book of Steiner's. And this has a question of giant forces, which is an odd term, but he's talking about these ancient druids, and they did some of this stuff. He says, I can make use of giant forces for my own purposes by burning the plant, for instance, and reducing it to ashes, to charcoal and so on. In this, our case, we're really after that alchemical salt. And this was in fact done, this was in fact one of the ways of making medicines out of plants by employing frost, snow, and ice by the use of burning and calcinations. The word calcination itself actually is related to the word chalk, which is calc, which is calcium, which is lime. So to calcinate is to make chalk or to make chalky. So when you reduce something to such a point that all of the black and gray is burned off and all you're left with is the salts, that's calcination. You've reduced something to an alkaline state. Actually, that's interesting. All soluble salts, at least to my knowledge, are in fact alkaline. So they belong on the lime pole. So this is what we're really making. We're almost making like a quicklime that's really reactive against that specific pest. So it quicklime, if you apply it to your compost pile, will damp down excessive ethericity. If there's just too much wateriness, helps drink it up, makes it a nice mild pile. When you do this, you're doing that specifically against the etheric body of that particular pest. And it's a unique salt. Like if I take the salt of a varroa mite, I'm probably not going to notice anything. It might taste salty, and that's it. But if a varroa mite ends up with more of it, it's going to feel sick. And I actually really love the idea of it being fed to the bees. And then when the varroa mite tries to get to the bees, yeah, I think that could be really interesting. I'd love to see what would happen with that, because I don't know that anyone has done that. But See, I'm still learning. I'm learning right now, so this is great. So, um, cast iron is great because you can heat it. You'll end up with a bit of iron in there, so it could be a bit red. If you want to remove the red, you can use like a really strong magnet to just pull out any of the rust bits. Just don't touch the ash. Actually, nobody touch the ash directly because it's pretty caustic, especially if you've done the job right. One of the best ways to keep on learning about biodynamics, well, we might be continuing this series, and if you're interested in more of these, you'll be getting a survey, so you can tell them you want more of these. In addition to that, I'm offering other ways to learn. I'm doing a study group on my own website, and I'm doing other webinars as well. There's a bunch of opportunities, and it's kind of fun with COVID. Everybody wants to be doing webinars, so that's how I've been spending my time. So I'm going to continue, if that's okay, because we've got a few more quotes, and these are, again, all going to apply to dealing with pests. So now these are about universal principles that you could apply to any specific pest. Again, trying to figure out, well, why does this white cabbage fly prosper here? That's one thing. And then there's another, well, why does this grow here? That you're going to have to look into, because I can't answer all of the pests. I can only speak to the ones I'm specifically familiar with. But each one has a very narrow bandwidth of ideal conditions. If you could find plants that it simply doesn't like and plant it near them, like the flea beetle. If you have flea beetles on your squash, or if you have, let's say, flea beetles on your eggplant, they hate nicotine. So even if you take your tomato cuttings and just drop them underneath your eggplant, flea beetles are like, ooh, I hate this. Best, of course, would be to give your eggplant enough ethericity, enough compost, enough water, so they can grow quickly and shade their own soil. Because once that soil is shaded, the flea beetles can't keep up. And that's a real trick, because there's that tender point where the sun can come straight down and bake the soil around your eggplant. Then that's where you're going to see the most damage. But flea beetles have to be warmed from outside. They have to be surrounded always with that blanket of Saturn, so to speak. So Steiner even goes, there's another way you could do it. He says you could perhaps let it rot, this being your pests, for a more thorough effect, but it may be difficult to collect the decomposition products. Our goal is to bring about this sort of combustion or disintegration. So you could ferment them in theory. So you could ferment them, you could combust them. The goal, though, is to reduce them and allow certain things to gas off. This is an example. This is just, I wanted to show the picture. It's not actually a pest problem here. This is something I made of calcinating dandelion flowers, which I just thought was it's just a beautiful picture. It's not really a pest here, but I just love how they maintain their structure even after firing. If you touch them, they just shatter, but I think they're just beautiful. But this is really what we're after, the salt, and this is what it'll look like. So when Steiner says it looks a bit like pepper, yeah, sure, looks a bit like salt and pepper, but a bit like pepper. I really would think we should call it biodynamic salt rather than pepper, because we're after the ashes and it's all alkaline. So yeah, that's just me, maybe. But once you grind it, it may look like something like this. Again, if you see still some gray, that's still some carbon. You could put it through another burning. Do you have to be so precise? No. If you're going to go for full board alchemy or spagyrics, yeah, you'd want to keep refining it. But for this case, for most people, yeah, it'll probably do. But again, this is salt here. So yeah, there's another quote from Steiner, and he says about calcium. And this is calcium and the calcium pole, which all belongs together, that alkaline side. He says that calcium kills or subdues the etheric body, thereby liberating the activities of the astral body. That is the case with all lime. If we want a rampant etheric body to contract in a very harmonious and regular manner without producing shocks in the organism, we must use calcium in the structure like we find it in oak bark. So when you want to, for example, remove a fungus from your plant, but you don't want to apply quicklime directly to your plant, which would kill it, you need it in an organic living form like oak bark. So that's why we use oak bark preparation. The opposite is true when we come to these pests. We do not want them to feel, we don't want them to feel good. We want them to taste some of this stuff and go, whoa, and want to leave. So that's really what we're after here, is more of a shock in that case than the other. But even that is relatively gentle. You're only having to kill the initial rounds instead of day after day, year after year, you're killing the pest. Yeah, the quote didn't appear on the screen. I didn't put it on the screen. So yeah, I was just reading it myself. So we made it to Q&A. I know there are more questions, so let's have some of those. And at this point, if anyone wants to, this is a good time to chime in and use your video because you won't be interrupting me at all. Someone asked, do you pepper for dandelions in certain areas? Yeah, you could pepper for dandelions in your garden if you had dandelions just appear everywhere. The whitefly remedy is the same as the rest of this. I don't have a particular problem with whitefly, so I don't think about it specifically. Cabbage worm, it's the same. Collect the worms, burn the worm. But in addition, the cabbage worm and whitefly, neither of them like these aromatic essential oil plants. So I like, there's a, what is it? It's a rosin. Yeah, rosin calendula. Rosin calendula is what I really like. It's just such a high oil plant. I mean, you could even look at sage or white sage. There are so many possible herbs here. Yeah. Someone said, where do you buy treatments that I see other farmers using? Can you explain that question? I'm not sure what you're asking. Are you asking about the biodynamic preparations themselves? If you are asking about those remedies, you can look at the Josephine Porter Institute, and they have enough for small growers, even to large growers. If you're a large contract grower, someone like Earth Legacy Agriculture also grows them. That's with Hugh Courtney. Both produce very good preparations. It's not a question of one versus the other. These are the people who do it. Also, Lloyd Nelson, I think, Biodynamic Source. Yeah, Biodynamic Source. That's out west. Again, these are all very good preparations. All right, I'm having to look through some of these questions, and I'm probably not going to get to all of these. Someone says it's have invasive plants such as nettle and dogbane by burning and scattering would be appropriate, but it'd be 4 years. Specifically, when it comes to the plant, you want to get the seeds. When it comes to a pest, or you burn the whole pest. When it comes to an animal, you burn the skin. You really want to get that reproducing part. So if you have something that reproduces by rhizomes, you'll want to burn the rhizomes, like something like bamboo, so you can inhibit bamboo spreading using something like this. It's not that it can necessarily just take 4 years to see results. You may see results faster than that, but because it depends on the life cycle of these plants. Like certain pests have a 4-year life cycle. That's how long they're in the soil and then reproduce, become an adult for another year or so. It depends on the plant itself, and it's about interrupting its life cycle. If you're able to do that by whatever management methods, even if it's mowing or plowing, whatever it is, in combination with something like this, again, you don't get rid of your other ways of dealing with it, but you would want to take the seeds themselves and burn those. It also gives a reason to prevent those seeds from blowing around. Someone's asking for suggestions for caterpillars, slugs, and snails that are eating young seedlings. If they're cut at the stem, the ground level, that's hard to say. If you don't know what it is, I'm going to have a hard time giving a specific remedy for that. I might encourage a row cover of, some sort of breathable fabric, at least initially, at least at night. Someone saying, with immature compost now in my soil beds, best to plant nasturtiums and nettles for a season. Do you know what plants would do well with such a soil? If you plant nettles, they're going to be there forever, just so you know. So be careful where you plant them. I'd plant them around beds or around the garden so you can constantly be tilling and kind of keeping them at bay. Yeah, I would plant nasturtiums around all of those. Immature compost is fine for things like squash and these rampantly growing things that produce a leaf and then a flower and then another leaf and another flower, those things can tolerate half-finished compost just fine. And in your case, cucumbers can be okay with that. But if you have an aphid problem, it just means it's really too immature. And nasturtiums would be a really good idea in that setting. Seedlings are all brassicas. Yeah, those can, that's all tricky. Yeah, I don't know how to deal with that specifically. It depends on your soil type. It depends on the air around those plants. And I can't say what's killing them from here. So someone's asking, is there a proper order to apply multiple preparations? So for example, if you have moon force excess and dampness, equisedum is right. Yes. Do we need to consider using the other biodynamic preparations first in order for equisedum to be effective? No, you don't. You can think of it more of an herbal remedy. It'll work in you whether or not you've taken biodynamic preparations. It will help with your kidneys and relieve water from you. Yeah, the plant vitality in general might be better if you've already used the preparations before that, but honestly, equisedum is one of the most effective and easiest ways to get into biodynamics because it has a tradition of herbal use with human beings. And then you're like, oh, I just am doing the same thing with plants. And then you can start to almost reverse engineer some of the biodynamic preparations by paying attention to how they were used traditionally. I really think herbalism at the traditional uses in indigenous communities of these herbs is the key to understanding why or how they work at all. Yeah. Oh yeah, sustainable settings, Lloyd Nelson, source for biodynamic preps. Yes, burning to salt would work on mealybugs, yes. Any of these pests, the principle works for the same species. Someone asked about planting and growing equisedum because it can be invasive. It can. The thing is, if you know that you have an infinite source of something that you can use to combat fungus, you'll probably end up using it. So I would check around to see if someone else in the area has a patch that they don't spray. Maybe gather from that, they probably love you. You have a new best friend because you're mowing down what they consider to be a problem and you've made it into a resource. Someone's asking about harlequin bugs, what attracts them. Harlequin bugs in particular are attracted by smelly plants. That can be either unfinished manure or the plant, for some reason, its spirit isn't holding the template together properly and it's leaking. And harlequin bugs are, ooh, that smells good. They like the smell of this other organism's internal scent or what should have remained internal. Yeah. Snakes. Well, snakes again. You can deal with them the same way as anything else, and burning the skin of them. That seems kind of brutal, but other than that, I don't have a particular way to deal with snakes. Mammals are trickier because, again, they have their own internalized climate, their whole internalized astral body that allows them to move about and even go into places that are uncomfortable to get what they want and then leave. So you've got to be persistent when it's something like that. Do you have a snake problem with your garden, or sorry, in terms of eating plants or eggs or something, I assume? Yes, nettle tea, dandelion teas are very smelly, but they don't attract pests. No, if you're giving to them as a medicine, you can often counterbalance the stink that would be attracting the other pest to the living plant. So yeah, the pest itself might be attracted to the smelly crock, but it's not going to be able to do much there. It'll just fall into the crock and die. So as soon as you've sprayed it out, by the next day the scent is gone. Plants absorbed it and has become odorless once more. Plants in particular are designed to absorb odors. That's one really nice thing about them, is that if you have a canopy, even some smelly things around it, they're absorbing it. If you have the smell of ammonia or manure near plants, you can see they'll grow bigger near it, even if they're not touching it, just because they're able to absorb carbon dioxide as a nutrient. They're able to absorb ammonia as a nutrient. Someone asked if a bubbler can be used to replace stirring. It would work for something like the equisedum or these teas we're talking about, the smelly teas, sure. And actually, it would make them accelerate in their decomposition because oxygen helps break apart structures that are formed with carbon. So that's not a bad thing to do. The stirring can't really be replaced when it comes to the colloidal humus preparations, because it doesn't matter how long you bubble it, it will not dissolve in water. Humus is non-water soluble, so to get it evenly distributed, you would need to stir it or agitate it properly for a long enough period of time. Humus in general will just sink to the bottom, or maybe some of it will float, but it will not dissolve by itself. Peach leaf curl. That is another equisetum remedy, and that is another thing where there's too much dampness around the tree. Open the tree up. It needs more light. Actually, most peach trees need way more light than they're being given. You need to broad fork around the edge of it so that you can crack the soil, allow air and light into the soil around the peach. Basically, that whole pattern that I was showing you at the beginning, which I'll pull back to if I can. Let's see, this one. No, not this one. Let's see, here we go. All right. This. When you want a tree to do well, you need Saturn to come into influence in the soil. You do not want it to be heavy and full of moon sources underneath. So that's really what you're after. You want a lot of air, warmth, not just around the plant. You do want that, particularly with the case with peach, but you also want it to be able to get into the soil, which sounds unusual, even counterintuitive. But if you look at how people manage vineyards, they're often plowing and breaking it up in order to help make it more like its traditional, Middle Eastern climate than what it would natively be. So like on a loam, they'll break it up to allow that water to evaporate because you want smaller, tighter fruits. And peach, I would treat peach very much the same way. Someone's asking, I'm trying to harvest herbs on a leaf day during a waxing moon. I'm wondering if anyone takes it further, working with Venus or Saturn placements. I can't speak directly to that. Maybe someone else here could. I don't specifically. The thing is with Saturn, Steiner refers to transplanting conifers, and he says that we need to pay attention to it's a very strange passage, even in German, about like the sun shining or the rising Saturn aspect. And it's quite ambiguous. It took a long time for me to figure out what he was talking about. But what he really means is when you transplant perennials, this means shrubs and trees, they can't regrow their rootstock. You need to pay attention to the Saturn, the warm air side, and transplant it accordingly so that the north-oriented roots stay to the north, the south stay to the south. If you don't, you'll get what you see often in parks where there's landscaping. You'll see the roots wrapping back across each other, strangling themselves because they're still trying to grow north. So we need to pay attention to where we plant things in terms of the Saturn aspect, which is the sunny side. And yes, there may be another subtle influence from the planet itself. So like right now, most of the planets are rising, so they look from our perspective like they're going up every time they appear at night. So you could consider that in terms of the Saturn rising influence. Annuals don't need to think about that because they can regrow their entire rootstock no matter what direction you plant them. So I don't follow it that precisely when it comes to the planetary processes and herb harvesting. Like I don't look to the outer planets. Pears are a bit more lunar than peach. Peach is a far more Saturn governed thing. You can see just if you take two fruits and one floats and one sinks, you could actually say that the sinking one has a more earthy lunar quality and the floating one has more of an astral atmospheric quality, like an apple will float, whereas a pear will generally sink. Very different. How do you know which way to plant a tree initially? That's a huge problem. It really is. Yeah, because you don't know when you get it from a nursery. And you may wonder why, wow, like these two trees are growing great, but these aren't. Often it has to do with that. And this is an old tradition. The Native Americans would transplant trees using this, and they would mark the side that was north and make sure it stayed that way. If you're sensitive to that when you transplant, that's great. But the thing is, I don't know of any nursery that is making a conscious effort to do that. So you're going to end up with problems. You're going to end up with problems if you graft a branch from the south-facing warm side, assuming you're northern hemisphere, from the Saturn side. See, easier. I can say it with one word. If you take a graft from the Saturn side and put it to the shady side, that too will probably not do well, because that's just not what it was from. So you have to pay attention to all of these. How do you know where to plant it initially? You might be able to look at it. If you're careful and you can pay attention, trees are not circles, they're oblong, and they grow more on the sunny side than they do on the shady side. So the Saturn side will be more expansive in terms of the rings, but again, it will be more and more towards the sunny side. Someone asked, do you buy specific calendula to get high rosin quantity? Yeah, there's I think it's rosin variety. It's called rosin or rosina. Rosin calendula. Yeah, it's very high. It's just one that's been selected over time to have a very high oil content. And I like to have those all through my garden because I'm really low, coastal, and humid. So fungal problems, slug problems, a lot of these damp issues that a lot of you were talking about, I don't really have a problem with. And I attribute it largely to these aromatic oil herbs throughout the garden. Heavier part of the tree. Actually, almost the opposite. The trees, the branches will be shorter on the north side, or rather the shady side. They'll be longer and bigger because they're reaching towards the light, and they're short on the shady side. But it's hard to tell sometimes when you get a plant that's been stripped of all its branches. I hope that answers as many questions as I can. I know I wasn't able to get to everybody's, but again, you can check our website at perennialroots.com or email us directly at perennialroots@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer as much as I can. It's just, yeah, I'm sorry. There's only as much as I can get to in 90 minutes, and this is a big topic.
Indeed, and thank you so much, Stewart, for bringing this to us and sharing your knowledge. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for participating tonight. Tomorrow I'll be sending out the video recording and, as Stewart mentioned, a brief survey. Please share your feedback, your thoughts, anything you'd like to see in the future. As Stewart has shared, we are collaborating on what this session might look like going forward and having more webinars, and that would be announced on our webpage and via social media when we have dates for that. So I look forward to sharing that with you in the future. And thank you all for your time.